This is a talk about drugs and the Dharma, and I probably should know better than to talk about drugs and the Dharma in the same sentence, and I certainly usually don't. Encouraging drug use is not my intention, and it would seem that there really is no obvious link between drugs and the Dharma in this country. However, there is one indirect link that to me is very interesting, and it's worth risking a discussion, and I'm doing it. In general, in my experience, drugs are not per se dharmic, but there's one exception, and that's LSD. And although this thought may not be popular, here's what I think. For me, the direct results of LSD had to do with with the nature of the mind and how the mind worked. When acid came on the scene in the early 1960s, it was not just looked at, or it was not just another fun high or something interesting like marijuana. Actually, it struck at the core of the 1950s fixed mentality and kind of split it wide open. In a very real sense, the genie was out of the bottle. It's a real testimony to the universality of the truth of the Dharma that it doesn't have to come in a Tibetan or a Japanese wrapper. Rather, the Dharma is exactly like the laws of nature. It's right up there with gravity and sunshine. It just is. We don't break the laws of nature. They break us. And it's the same with the Dharma. We work with it and not against it. So when LSD first came along and began to lay bare some of the internal workings of the mind, in truth, that was my first real Dharma lesson. Like a mental tsunami, acid left in its wake chaos and instability, but also insights and clarity for many of us, even at that first taste. And it certainly did not have the name of Dharma stamped on it, but in truth it was very dharmic. And when, about a decade later, when the great Dharma masters like Chogyam Trungpa came along, they made quick work of our acid trips. It suddenly just started to make sense. And unlike those of us with acid experience, where we might have this insight correct, but no idea where to fit it into the overall scheme of life, the Dharma always seemed to have a place for it. Everything we saw in the light of LSD fit together with the Dharma teachings. It was like plugging a piece into a jigsaw puzzle. And I had been to the brightest minds that I knew, like the Catholic Jesuits, and shared my acid experience asking for an explanation. But unfortunately, they didn't have a clue. Have faith was about all they said. With my LSD experiences, I had somehow ventured beyond the pale of society's consensus, and into uncharted waters, territory probably usually reserved for shamans and those who find themselves in alternate realities and alternative states of mind. To myself, I really was like the proverbial voice crying in the wilderness, and there were suddenly millions of us, and we could not just sort it out. What we were seeing was just too different. But like the Dharma, it was a wake-up call. When the great Dharma teacher I mentioned earlier, Chogyam Trungpa, came on the scene in the early 1970s, all of that kind of began to change. He was totally at home with whatever he had come across and whatever we had come across in our minds about LSD, about acid, and never even blinked. In fact, it's reputed that Trungpa once took LSD and his only comment was, quote, "nothing happened," unquote. Not only was acid not a challenge to Trungpa, but he was able to show people like myself how each insight into the nature of the mind that LSD had given us fit precisely into an overall approach to training the mind that the Tibetans knew all about. Everything my generation, the hippies and the beats, could throw at Trungpa just became more grist for his mill. So believe me, back then that was impressive. And he immediately tamed thousands of us who had fallen into the scary habit of thinking that, well, we must be the Lone Ranger, and we're somehow super unique because of our LSD experiences. Trungpa settled that question with a simple comment. Nothing we saw in the mind was news to him. Out of the chaos of our acid experiences, Trungpa managed to organize them, to bring order. And we just obediently got in line because here was a master, somebody that could talk directly to us about our most intimate insights. Now, what we had seen on acid was the truth, or part of it. Like we had glimpsed something, and we were not about to give that up. But like a piece of a puzzle, we had little to no idea where this or that insight kind of fit into an overall view. And Trungpa showed how all of our pieces fit into the larger picture. And he did it so successfully that we actually got it. At least in my case, those two powers changed my life. First came LSD, and then came Trungpa. These two things helped make sense of it all. And I tell this story because it explains my ambivalence when it comes to drugs. I never got much out of any drugs, except maybe some entertainment, with the exception of LSD. But I would be a liar if I said that I did not learn something of extreme importance from taking LSD. Now, that being said, I should hasten to point out that I sincerely believe that acid was useful at a particular time in history, a time when the fixed dichotomy, duality of the current thinking of the time, that we're talking about what we were coming out of the 1950s, that kind of thinking needed some air, and acid was just simply a shortcut to the future. It paved the way for what we call the 60s, the 1960s, and in my opinion, it was the principal catalyst for the whole hippie revolution. Nothing else came even close, and I welcome anyone to try to challenge me on that, just because it just seems to me to be so obvious. And the fact that what we saw on LSD, the fact that it turned out to be part of the Dharma, is a perfect testimony to its truth and universality. So it's thank goodness that the Tibetans, unfortunately driven out of their country, wandered into America and showed us where the pieces of the puzzle of the mind that we saw in acid fit. Once I found the Dharma, drugs no longer interested me, because it wasn't the drugs in drugs, the drugginess that I was fascinated about. It was the insight into the nature of my psychology, of my mind. Now, I'll elaborate a bit. I would be surprised if many of those listening here know how much of our worldview is embedded in what we call the self and the self's perspective. I had little to no idea that what we see out there in the world, what we all see each day, is very much what we project from our mind in here. We're brought up to believe that what we see in the world around us is objective fact, simply, the way things are, the way it is. I had my first clue that I had it pretty much backward on May 6th of 1964, when I was living in Berkeley, California for a year, and I had just dropped LSD for the first time. And acid was so new back then that what I took was some of the original Stendos laboratories, acid from Switzerland. Now, there's no need to describe my whole trip, or hopefully to warn you off from running out and taking LSD today. That was then, and this is now. For one, acid has changed, and certainly the need and the times for it have really changed. But back then, LSD was a segue into a new time, a new view for an entire generation. My point here is, aside from acid literally blowing my mind, the main takeaway from that acid trip was the realization that much or most of what I see out there in the world is what I project from deep inside of me. I don't mean that I just understand that as a concept, but rather it was then that I realized in real time about my ability of my mind to project. And I'll just give one clear example, a little embarrassing, but it's the truth. Back then we had mostly heard stories of acid, but few of us had yet experienced it. Remember, this was in the early 60s. The rumor was that LSD was anything you thought it was, which turned out to be, more or less true. Despite my attempts to make sure that I was in a secure location when I dropped acid, I was not. I made the person who was chaperoning me promise that no matter what I said to the contrary, after I took acid, she was going to be with me, she would not leave me alone. I mean, I was afraid what I might do. I'd heard so many stories about acid. So, clear enough? Yet the first time I told her that I was fine and that she should just go, she just up and split. Bam! My influence with her was just that strong. She just believed me and was gone. Anyway, there I was, totally immersed in the phantasmagoria of an acid trip, and at the same time loose late at night on the streets of Berkeley, California. And as I passed a dark alley, I could hear laughter. I kind of looked back in it. As I peered into the darkness, I could see someone coming toward me. It was a black couple. They were really drunk and kind of stumbling in my direction. I could see that the woman was leaning into the man and clinging to his waist. I was apprehensive because then, blacks and prejudice, went hand in hand. So I kind of drew back. Then the couple emerged into the streetlight at the end of the alley where I was. And oh my God, they were white. Not only were they white, they were just a couple of college kids out on a date. Now, what was I to think about that? Well, what I thought was that in the quicksilver speed of acid, I had somehow intercepted my ingrained prejudice. And in that slow motion time that LSD can provide, I could suddenly see the wizard behind the curtain, who was actually perhaps more like an idiot. As mentioned earlier, this was not a thought, not a little piece of understanding. This was a real-time living movie that I was in, and I had just stepped behind the curtain of my own self for the very first time. My bias, my prejudice, and my ingrained reactions were suddenly out of the bag and just obvious to me. I had never seen them before. I had actually caught myself in a contradiction, and I had seen for the very first time that the world that I lived in was a movie screen upon which I projected what I had learned, what I had been taught to project, all of my likes, my dislikes, my biases, and my prejudice. I was stunned. Wow. And the whole acid trip that night was just like that. In that LSD experience, I woke up for the first time to real-time psychology. I was suddenly a player within my own mind and no longer just kind of a self-conscious onlooker. From that day forward, I was a full-time phenomenologist. I'd step behind the curtain of the self, where the projector's located, and I was soon fiddling with the gears. I was never the same again. And as they say, that's a good thing. In the crew-cut straitjacket world of the 1950s from which I was emerging, I and everyone I knew, we were wrapped way too tight to have any real kind of life. The whole society was similarly frozen, staring at the same locked step movie that I had just stepped out of. Just imagine that. That was the 1950s. And I was not the Lone Ranger. I was not alone. My whole generation soon joined me, and we stepped through the back of the mirror together and then down the rabbit hole without as much as a goodbye to the status quo. It was total freedom compared to where we came from, so we finally understood something. Of course, it's not quite as simple as that. What I saw on acid took me years to absorb and even longer to stabilize, which is why I don't recommend drugs. Anyway, Dharma practice can do the same thing without the dangers and the need to stabilize. But back in 1964, Dharma in America had not reached so far as Ann Arbor, Michigan, at least not in a form that I could assimilate. So it was then that I began to study my own reactions in earnest. And there weren't like just a few, but many. It appeared that I reacted to almost anything, and I was reacting just all the time. My personal likes and dislikes filtered almost everything I experienced, and it was not like my tastes were something special. The net effect was that I was looking through prescription eyeglasses that were anything but rose-colored. Pure, unfiltered experience was almost never on my menu. I was a creature not only of my habits, but of every bias and prejudice, kind of slammed against the walls of the mind by my every passing wince, my every passing reaction. And until I began to develop some awareness of all of this, I never even knew all this was happening. The social mind that emerged from the 1950s was pretty much airtight. Those my age that I knew had no clue either. All of this started to loosen up in the early 1960s, and in my opinion, largely because of the advent of LSD. This may not be a popular observation of mine, but to the best of my experience, it's the truth. Acid exposed the unity of the observer and the observed to most of a generation. We begin to witness our own projections, and in particular, the fact that the strict dichotomy of the subject in here and the object out there just wasn't real. It was not a truth. It was like it's the Heisenberg principle incarnate, the fact that the state of our mind directly influences what we see, what we believe, what we see and believe is out there in the external world. LSD unhinged an entire generation, and that was not a bad thing, but it was a little difficult, and the door of the mind for all of us blew wide open. Suddenly there was so much to do, and watching the kaleidoscope of the mind reveal its secrets one by one was riveting. It still is today. The concrete iceberg of who knows how many previous generations was melting, was breaking up a chunk at a time. And whatever spirit had been trapped in that frozen state was freed, and it lived again. Suddenly it was the 60s. So even before the Dharma poured into this country, it was already at work here. Because Dharma doesn't belong to any religion or any country. We all share it. When great teachers like Chogyam Trungpa arrived on the scene, they just showed us how to do it properly. They gave us practice methods that actually worked. However, the mind was already waking up way before that.